My name is Olivia Prescott. I am 34, and I run a firm designing guest experiences for boutique hotels. My husband, Derek Ashford, develops luxury resorts, and people described us as a couple who built everything together. My systems shaped his properties, and his projects helped my company grow. I never imagined he had begun treating my work and trust as things he could take. That afternoon, 16 investors gathered in a resort conference room for the presentation of Derek's largest project. My company had created the guest experience system, including arrivals, staff training, and service standards. Derek said my presence would reassure everyone that the project was stable. I arrived expecting a business meeting. Natalie Crawford stood near the windows talking with two investors. She had joined Derek's company 5 months earlier as a branding consultant, and she was holding a dark navy notebook. When she opened it, I saw my initials pressed inside the cover. Derek had given me that notebook when we bought our first home, and I had filled it with strategies, client notes, and ideas. The notebook had disappeared from my office 3 weeks earlier. Derek told me I had probably left it during a project visit, and after searching everywhere, I accepted his explanation. Now, Natalie was reading from my pages while explaining the resort strategy as if those ideas belonged to her. When Derek noticed me watching, he did not look surprised. He looked like a man calculating which explanation would cost him the least. He walked over and told me not to create tension in front of important people. I looked at Natalie, then at the investors taking their seats. I waited until the introductions ended, stood, and announced that my company was suspending every license and operational system connected to Derek's resort until ownership questions were reviewed. The room went silent. Most people thought they had witnessed the beginning of a marriage falling apart. And so did I. Grace Monroe found me sitting alone in my car nearly 40 minutes after the meeting ended. I had sent her my location without a single word because I could not explain what had happened. She listened until I finished, then told me this was no longer a conversation about betrayal. She said we needed facts before Derek had time to replace them with explanations. The next morning, Grace drove me to meet Victoria Sloan, an attorney who handled disputes involving family businesses and intellectual property. Victoria read every message Derek had sent after the meeting without interrupting me. She asked about my company, my contracts, and every agreement between my business and Derek's development firm. By the time I finished answering, I realized she had barely asked about Natalie at all. Victoria explained that emotions belonged in private, but documents belonged in court. She wanted every licensing agreement, every payment record, and every approval connected to my company. I logged into my business files and started gathering contracts, invoices, and archived emails. What I believed was the story of an affair was slowly becoming the story of something much larger. Grace reviewed my calendar while I searched through company records. We noticed Derek's business trips had become more frequent during the same months. Natalie joined his team. Several payments to her consulting company had increased far beyond what I considered reasonable for branding work. There were also meetings listed under my name that I had never attended. Victoria asked one final question before I left her office. She wanted to know whether I had ever signed paperwork giving Derek permanent ownership of my company's guest experience system. I answered immediately because I knew that decision would have ended everything I had built. I told her I had never signed anything like that. She closed the file, looked directly at me, and quietly said that was exactly what she needed to verify next. Emily Dawson asked to meet me before the office opened. She arrived carrying a folder she had kept locked in her desk since Derek approached her. He had asked for the source files behind my guest experience system a month earlier. Emily refused because there was no written approval in our project log, and Derek was not authorized to request them. She said Derek became irritated when she questioned him. 2 days later, Natalie called and offered her a paying position if she became more cooperative with the transition they were planning. Emily did not understand what transition meant. but the offer made her uncomfortable enough to save every email. She sent only a preview package and kept the editable files in our protected system. Victoria reviewed Emily's messages while Grace sat beside me. Then she opened a folder containing contract amendments Derek's company had circulated without my approval. The documents expanded his right to use my systems beyond the resort and treated my methods as assets his company could control. My name appeared throughout the paperwork, but I had never seen those terms. The next emails hurt more because Natalie had written them herself. She suggested creating a new hospitality brand after the financing closed, then moving my systems into that company under a different name. She wrote that investors would accept the transition more easily if I stayed visible through the launch. In another message, she said, my reputation reassured women travelers, so removing me early might create questions. I read each line, hoping there was context that would make it less deliberate. There was none. Natalie was not simply sleeping with my husband while believing our marriage had ended. She knew Derek planned to keep using my face, my staff, and my work until the investment money arrived. Grace asked whether I still believed Natalie knew nothing about my business. I could not answer because the emails had answered for me. The affair was personal, but this plan required meetings, documents, and choices made over time. Natalie had not wandered into my marriage by accident. She had stepped into the future Derek was preparing to take from me. Victoria spent the next 2 days tracing every payment connected to Derek's resort project. Grace compared those records with the contracts my company had signed over the past 2 years. The numbers stopped matching almost immediately. Money that should have supported project operations had been redirected through Natalie Crawford's consulting firm. The consulting fees looked far beyond the work Natalie had been hired to perform. Several invoices described research projects that never appeared in any planning documents. Other payments were approved only days before investor meetings, where my company presented new systems. Victoria said the pattern suggested those invoices were being used for something other than legitimate consulting work. Grace kept following the payment trail until it reached another group of financial records. Some of the questionable expenses had not remained inside Derek's company. They had been processed through Natalie's business before moving to other accounts. Victoria quietly pointed at the dates and explained that anyone reviewing the transactions later would naturally begin with the company that issued those invoices. I stared at the documents without saying anything. Derek had convinced Natalie she was becoming his future business partner. Yet the paperwork told a different story. If investigators ever questioned those transactions, her company would appear directly connected to every suspicious payment. For the first time, I wondered whether she understood the position Derek had placed her in. Later that afternoon, Victoria received another batch of accounting records. They showed Derek personally approving nearly every payment sent to Natalie's company, while leaving very little written explanation for the services provided. Grace looked at me and said this was no longer about replacing me inside my own business. Derek had created a financial trail that protected himself first. I finally understood what Victoria had been trying to show me since our first meeting. Derek had not built one lie. He had built an entire system where every person served a purpose until they became a problem. I had been expected to lose my company, and Natalie had been positioned to absorb the blame if anyone ever started asking the wrong questions. I thought the investigation had already uncovered the worst part of Derek's plan. Then, Lucas Montgomery called Victoria and asked whether he could postpone the next investment meeting until the ownership dispute became clearer. He explained that several financial documents no longer matched the presentations he had received. Victoria thanked him, promised a formal response, and ended the call without saying more. She turned toward me and said the pressure outside Derek's company had finally begun. Later that afternoon, Emily returned with something she had almost forgotten to mention. Weeks earlier, she had recorded an internal planning meeting after Derek became angry about the missing source files. The recording captured Derek explaining that my company would disappear after the financing closed because operating everything under one brand would look cleaner to investors. Natalie was also on that recording, calmly discussing how employees could be moved one department at a time, until nobody questioned the change. The recording ended. But Emily had also saved the follow-up emails from that meeting. Natalie received responsibility for preparing the transition schedule, while Derek approved every major decision himself. Reading those messages made it impossible to believe she had simply followed instructions without understanding the outcome. She knew my company was expected to vanish while my work continued generating profit for someone else. The next morning, Victoria received a notice involving Natalie's consulting business. Financial reviewers had requested additional documentation supporting several invoices connected to Derek's project. Only a few minutes later, Natalie received an email from Derek telling her to organize every billing record before anyone else asked questions. He also reminded her that their consulting strategy had always been her recommendation. The wording was careful, but the responsibility was already moving toward her. Grace continued reviewing the communication history between them throughout the afternoon. She found another message sent only hours after the first notice arrived. Derek instructed Natalie to delete unnecessary conversations, avoid discussing past meetings by phone, and keep every explanation consistent if anyone contacted her. That was the first document showing he was protecting himself instead of protecting the woman he claimed to care about. By evening, Natalie received another letter through her attorney requesting financial records from her company. Almost immediately, Derek sent a new message asking her to accept responsibility for the consulting structure because she understood the branding strategy better than anyone else. Grace quietly placed both documents beside each other on the table. I looked at the dates, the language, and the timing. Derek had promised Natalie a future beside him, but the moment questions appeared, he was already preparing to leave her standing alone. The temporary hearing began 3 weeks later. Derek arrived with 2 attorneys and acted as though the dispute had grown out of a personal disagreement instead of months of planning. Victoria organized our evidence in the exact order she wanted the court to see it. She started with the contracts, then the financial records, and finally the communication history linking every decision together. Emily testified first because her role was simple and supported by documentation. She explained that Derek had requested the editable source files without written authorization and confirmed she refused because company policy required my approval. The court then reviewed the emails showing Natalie offering Emily a position after the financing closed if she cooperated with the transition. Those documents established that the proposed takeover had been discussed long before I discovered the missing notebook. The technology specialist appeared next and examined the licensing documents submitted by Derek's company. System records showed several electronic files had been modified after the dates printed on the agreements. The approval history also confirmed I had never authorized permanent ownership of my company's guest experience system. Derek's attorneys challenged the conclusions, but the original metadata remained unchanged. Then the courtroom doors opened again, and Natalie walked inside with her attorney. She admitted she had accepted Derek's relationship, believed his marriage was already over, and participated in discussions about replacing my company's identity after the investment closed. She also admitted she accepted consulting payments that should have raised more questions. Everything changed when she began handing over documents her attorney had preserved after Derek asked her to delete their conversations. Those records included emails, internal planning notes, and messages sent after the financial review began. Natalie showed that Derek instructed her to keep using my notebook during the investor presentation because he wanted to see whether I would challenge him in public. She also produced messages directing her to organize the consulting invoices, delete unnecessary conversations, and accept responsibility for the billing structure if anyone investigated the payments. The same man who promised her a future had already prepared an explanation that left her carrying the blame. After reviewing the testimony and supporting records, the judge ordered every disputed contract, financial file, and electronic record preserved while the investigation continued. Temporary control over my guest experience system remained with my company until ownership could be fully resolved. The court also restricted further transfers connected to the resort project until the financial review was complete. When the hearing ended, The balance of power no longer belonged to Derek. After the hearing, the consequences arrived one decision at a time, instead of all at once. Lucas Montgomery officially suspended his investment until every ownership issue had been resolved. Other investors followed his lead over the next several days because they no longer trusted the financial records behind the project. Derek tried to present the delays as temporary, but the momentum he had spent years building began to disappear. The financial review continued moving through every payment connected to the resort development. Auditors requested additional records. Outside consultants withdrew from the project, and several contracts were placed on hold. My company continued operating because our systems remained protected under the court's temporary order. Employees who had worried about losing their jobs finally knew where they stood. Natalie's situation changed just as quickly. Her consulting business lost its largest clients after companies learned it was part of the ongoing investigation. She was forced to sell her condominium to repay a portion of the consulting fees that had already been questioned. To reduce further legal exposure, she agreed to continue cooperating with investigators and provide any additional records they requested. The career Derek promised her disappeared long before the investigation ended. Derek reached out several times after the hearing, but every message focused on the project instead of the damage he had caused. He insisted everything could still be repaired if I restored the licenses and helped calm the investors. I never answered those requests because the court already had every document that mattered. The decisions ahead no longer depended on promises. They depended on evidence. I did not celebrate what happened to Natalie because there was nothing to celebrate. She had made choices that helped Derek build his plan, and she was paying for them. Derek had made sure she would also carry the consequences the moment his own position became unstable. Looking back, I realized neither of us had been the exception. We had simply been assigned different roles inside the same system Derek believed he could control. I never measured my recovery by what Derek lost. I measured it by what I no longer had to surrender. 1 year later, my company was larger than it had been before the investigation began, and every system we created carried only our own name. Lucas became one of our longest-standing clients, and Emily accepted a leadership role she had earned through courage instead of convenience. Natalie left the hospitality industry before the investigation was fully completed. Her consulting company no longer existed, and she accepted a communications position with a nonprofit organization while continuing to repay the money connected to the questioned invoices. We crossed paths once at a neighborhood coffee shop, and neither of us looked away. She admitted she finally understood Derek had never been choosing between two women. He had only been deciding who would be useful next. I told her I could not erase the choices she had made, and she quietly agreed. She said the hardest part was realizing she had helped someone destroy another woman's future while believing she was building her own. There was nothing else either of us needed to say. We walked away in different directions, carrying different consequences from the same decisions. Derek contacted me several more times over the following months. Every message sounded more polished than the one before, but none of them changed the documents, the financial records, or the testimony that already existed. I never replied because every answer I once searched for had already been written inside the evidence. Silence finally belonged to me instead of him. Today, the old notebook sits inside a cabinet at my office. I no longer open it because it belongs to a chapter that has already ended. Every new project begins inside a plain notebook with empty pages that no one else has touched. I write every idea knowing it belongs to the life I built after I stopped protecting someone, determined to erase my place in it.